Andy Stanley, and I'm so honored you've invited me to your group for the next few weeks, days, or if you're binge watchers, maybe just a few hours. I've written over 20 books. I have preached hundreds of sermons, but I've never been more excited about content than the content contained in Irresistible. And I hope you'll read the entire book, but if not, no worries. We will have plenty to talk about, and you will have plenty to discuss in your group. So let's get started. And there's no better place to start than a story. In 2005, my son Andrew, who was probably 13 at the time, went with me and another father-son duo to China. And while we were there, we toured an American-owned leather goods factory. The owner asked if he could be our guide, and we said, of course. And as we began, he introduced us to a Chinese girl who was probably in her early 20s, who had worked her way up to management. He asked if it would be okay if she shadowed us during our visit, and of course, we were fine with that. 2 hours later, we were back in his office for a quick recap, and as we wrapped up, he asked, does anyone have any questions, referring to the tour? And to all of our surprise, the Chinese girl raised her hand, but her question wasn't directed to our guide, which was her boss. Her question was directed at me, and she said this. She said, "Are you a pastor?" Now, I had no idea where this was going. I had not introduced myself as a pastor. I wasn't even sure if it was okay to be a pastor. After all, we were in China. I said, yes, I'm a pastor. But what she said next, well, you may find this hard to believe. I certainly did. But in her beautiful, broken English, she smiled and said, "How good is good enough? I recognize your voice." Well, as you can imagine, I was floored. How Good is Good Enough is the title of a little book I had recently published, but the book was based on a manuscript from a sermon that I had preached many years before. She said, 2 years ago, someone gave me a CD of your sermon, How Good is Good Enough. I listened to it over and over, and then I asked Jesus to save me and to live inside me. Before I was empty, and now I am full. Well, I was stunned, but she went on. She said, I wanted to go to church, but there are no churches in my city. She began attending a Bible study in an apartment close to where she lived. The closest church, as it turned out, was like an hour away. She said it took her almost 2 hours to get there by bus. But that wasn't her only question. Her follow-up question is why I'm sharing this bit of self-serving narrative. After telling us about how difficult it was to get to church, she asked, "Pastor, why doesn't everyone in America go to church?" I had no idea how to respond. How do you explain the marginalization of the church in America to a Chinese millennial who was empty but now is full? How do you explain thousands of empty churches to a young lady who would be there every time the door was opened, if there was a door to open? Honestly, I don't even remember how I responded, but I will never forget her question. It's bothered me ever since. And for the remainder of our time together, I'm going to do my best to bother you with it as well. Why doesn't everybody in America go to church? Why is the church so resistible? Jesus wasn't. Once upon a time, the church wasn't either. I've talked to, listened to, read interviews and blogs by dozens of people who've left the faith. I've yet to hear a single story by anyone who abandoned Christianity based on anything directly related to Christianity. In fact, I recently read a blog by a former worship leader at a church who left the faith after she read a book proving contradictions in the Bible. Well, apparently she grew up believing that the foundation of our faith is a non-contradicting book. It's not. One of the most renowned New Testament scholars in America announced really not too long ago that he lost his faith because of suffering in the world. But the foundation of our faith is not a world without suffering. Suffering doesn't disprove the existence of God. It only disproves the existence of a God who doesn't allow suffering. Whose God is that? Not ours. Ours actually promised it. Natural selection doesn't undermine the claims of Jesus. Neither does a 13.8 billion-year-old universe. And if something I said just made you wince, I cannot tell you how happy I am that you are participating in this study, because you are about to be introduced to a better, more robust version of your faith. To be clear, it's not a new version, and it's certainly not original with me. In fact, it's hidden in plain sight in the Gospels and in the epistles of the Apostle Paul. We know it works because, well, it already works. Once upon a time, members of a Jewish cult called the Way, against all odds, captured the attention and ultimately the dedication of the pagan world, both inside and outside the Roman Empire. So, what did these first century Christians know that we don't? What made their version of our faith so compelling, so resilient, so irresistible? How did a movement begun in the armpit of the Roman Empire survive the first century? It should have been buried right alongside its founder, but it wasn't. In fact, think about it. Today, Rome is adorned with crosses, and Jerusalem is filled with Christian tourists. 2,000 years ago, the cross symbolized the power of empire. Today, it symbolizes the power of God. How did that happen? And could it happen again? I think so. But to reclaim the clarity and the irresistibility of the early church, we have to come to terms with something that, well, may be a bit difficult to accept. Namely, that Jesus came to introduce something new. He did not show up suggesting a new version of an old thing or an update to an existing thing. Jesus was sent by the Father to introduce something entirely new, something brand new. And it was the new he came to introduce that made both him and his message practically irresistible. People who were nothing like him liked him, and he liked people who were nothing like him. He was loved by the unrighteous, but he was always viewed as a threat by the self-righteous. In fact, if you grew up in church, you know this. The most prominent narrative in the Gospels, the narrative theme in the Gospels that we find everywhere, is the incessant conflict between Jesus and religious leaders. Now, it's virtually impossible for us to wrap our minds around why the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the teachers of the law hated Jesus. They couldn't agree to just disagree. They hated him. They didn't just wish him dead, they orchestrated his arrest and execution. Now, while that seems a bit over the top to us, as it did to Pilate, by the way, they actually had good reason to fear Jesus. They saw what we miss. They didn't see Jesus as Judaism 2.0. They rightly understood him to be a threat to everything, as in everything they valued. If what he claimed was true, it signaled the end of, not a new version of, the world as they knew it. Modern Christians, us modern Christians, we see Jesus as an extension of, or perhaps a fulfillment of Jewish scriptures, our Old Testament. But the Jewish leaders in Jesus' day, they didn't see him as an extension or fulfillment of anything. From their vantage point, Jesus was introducing something new. And on this, they were correct. One of Jesus' most offensive statements is recorded in Matthew's gospel. And if you've read it, chances are you probably didn't even notice it. You certainly weren't offended by it. During one of his many squabbles with religious leaders over what entailed a violation of the Sabbath, Jesus, referring to himself, said the following. He said, "I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." Infuriating, right? No? Have you ever even noticed that statement before? Probably not. For first century Jews, nothing and no one was greater than the temple. If there was something greater than the temple, then the temple was pointless, useless. For first century Jews, the temple was everything. It was the center of the world, and not just their world, the world. The temple was the epicenter of Jewish religious life. It was the official home of the official law. The temple was the presence of God on earth. And to compare oneself to the temple, or to suggest that anything was greater than the temple, that just reflected extraordinary arrogance, ignorance, or maybe insanity. To claim that he was greater than the temple implied that the temple was temporary, which, as it turns out, was Jesus' point exactly. In fact, as we're about to discover, the temple wasn't even God's idea to begin with. And this represents our first major departure from the storyline that most of us grew up with. To support this rather audacious assertion, we will need to rewind to the days of Abraham after a brief layover with King David and his son Solomon. Now, as you probably know, it was never God's intention for ancient Israel to have a king other than himself. But all the cool kids had kings, and so the elders and the leaders of the nation confronted the prophet Samuel, and they insisted he appoint a king. Their words: "Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us, and to go out before us and to fight our battles." But of course, God did not intend for Israel to be like all the other nations. God intended for Israel to stand out from all the other nations because God was planning to do something through Israel on behalf of all the other nations. From the beginning, God had a global purpose for the nation of Israel. In fact, God's global plan was first revealed way before there was a nation. Around 2000 BC, God promised Abraham a son who would become a nation, and through that nation, God would bless the world, as in the entire world. Here's what God said to Abraham. He said, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, this had to sound ridiculous to a man who had no people, standing in the middle of nowhere. But there was something else unusual about this promise. God promised to bless the world through Abraham's descendants. Now, back in the day, ancient tribes didn't generally bless each other. They conquered, plundered, and enslaved each other. And let's face it, modern nations, we don't generally bless each other either. We spy on, negotiate with, and impose sanctions on each other. The point being, we can't begin to imagine how ridiculous this entire promise must have sounded to Abraham. But as you know, Abraham eventually had some people who eventually migrated to Egypt, where they eventually multiplied themselves to nation status, which of course made their host nation terribly uncomfortable. But instead of kicking them out, Pharaoh put them to work as slaves. Now, it's difficult to bless all the nations of the earth when you're making bricks for a king who considers himself master of the universe. But unlike Egypt's gods, Abraham's God was mobile. So when Abraham's God was good and ready, he showed up, he tapped Moses as his representative, and he sent him to Pharaoh with that unforgettable line that we all know, let my people go. Then after a bit of arm twisting, Pharaoh did just that. Now, you probably know this story. Israel eventually arrived safely in the promised land, but once they arrived, they didn't do much in the way of blessing the inhabiting nations. Instead, they conquered and on a few occasions actually plundered their way to dominance in the region. Then, after several generations of operating as a loosely organized theocracy, the elders decided it was time for Israel to be like all the other nations and get themselves a king. And so they did. The prophet Samuel anointed Saul as Israel's first king. And as you probably know, he was a disaster. But actually, most of Israel's kings were disasters. These royal disasters cost the nation in treasure and blood, but they were like all the other nations. Well, as you know, David followed Saul as Israel's second king, and one day it dawns on David that not only did all the cool kids have kings, all the cool kingdoms had temples. So David decided to build God a temple. Now, up until this time, God had been a Boy Scout of sorts. He actually lived in a tent. Now, it was a nice tent, but it was a tent. The Old Testament refers to this as the tabernacle. But just like Israel didn't need a king, Israel didn't need a temple either. In fact, they didn't need either for the same reason. They already had a king who could not be contained in a dwelling made by man. Besides, Israel lacked the essential ingredient for any well-equipped temple, an image. Remember, Yahweh, Israel's God, had no physical representation. In fact, we know that the temple was not God's idea because when King David introduced the idea, God responded with these words through the prophet Nathan. He said, I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. And he reminds David that he's the mobile God. But this is my favorite part. Listen to this. He says, wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers to whom I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house of cedar? In other words, God was fine living in a tent. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. It was a visible reminder that he was not a regional God like all the other gods. He was the mobile God. Just ask Pharaoh. But there was something else in play here. Everything about the tabernacle was temporary. It was constructed primarily of linen curtains, goat hair curtains, and wood. It was in constant need of repair. But the portable and temporary nature of the tabernacle underscored the point of the tabernacle. Everything about the tabernacle and everything connected to the tabernacle was a sign that pointed to something greater and grander in the future. The tabernacle was a means to an end, and in the end, the need for a tabernacle would end as well. So, God was fine with his temporary digs. Why? Because the entire sacrificial system and everything associated with it was temporary. In the end, God tells David he's got too much blood on his hands to build a temple. David doesn't argue, but he doesn't give up on the idea. And so David, as you probably know, made all the preparations necessary so that his son Solomon could begin construction immediately upon his coronation. And sure enough, when Solomon took the throne, the grand construction project began. 20 years later, it was completed. Now, at the end of those 20 years, King Solomon invited God to leave his tent, to leave his tabernacle, and to move indoors to this grand structure that he had built for God. And ultimately, God did. But before he did, God said something to Solomon that should have sent chills down his spine. It didn't, but it certainly should have. God gave Solomon the "before I hand you the car keys" talk. You remember that? Either the one your parents had with you, or perhaps the one or the ones that you've had with your kids. With my kids, it went something like this. I'm so happy I was able to purchase a car for you to drive. I hope you enjoy it, but understand, if you abuse this freedom, I'll sell it. Now, God's version to Solomon is found in 1 Kings, and it goes something like this. Solomon, I really appreciate all that's gone into creating this fabulous piece of architecture. I accept your gift, and I'll move in immediately. But Solomon, if I catch you or my people misbehaving out there because you think I'm tucked away safely in here, I will tear this place apart. All of that before he had even moved in. And if you think I'm making this up, read 1 Kings chapter 9. Here's just a taste of what God said to Solomon. He said, "This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, 'Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?'" So, while God was grateful for the beautiful home that Solomon built for him, he was not committed to staying there under just any conditions. God would see to the demolition of his own home if the people abandoned him for other gods. The temple was a nice to have, but it was not necessary. It wasn't his idea. In fact, the temple was more beautiful than it was necessary. Now, when Solomon became king, there was peace in the land. In fact, it looked like this might be the perfect time for God to bless all the nations of the world. But God wasn't ready, and it turns out Israel wasn't ready either. Solomon got a bit distracted by women, foreign women who worshiped foreign gods. The temple talk didn't stick. In fact, along with building Yahweh a temple, Solomon built a host of gods, their own miniature temples, to keep his foreign wives happy. How many temples, you ask? Are you ready for this? About 700. The author of 1 Kings tells us Solomon had 700 wives of royal birth, and he built altars, shrines, and houses of worship for each god worshipped by his 700 wives of royal birth. Worse, toward the end of his life, Solomon was worshiping these foreign gods right along with his wives. Israel was in no position to bless the nations of the earth. In fact, by the end of Solomon's reign, Israel looked a lot like all the nations of the earth. But whereas Solomon forgot his promise to God, God did not forget his promise to Solomon. In 587 BC, after a bloody siege, Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers poured through a breach in Jerusalem's walls, murdered thousands of citizens, enslaved thousands more, and tore Solomon's temple down to its foundation. Fortunately, God wasn't home that afternoon. Actually, he'd moved out long before. Now, the temple was eventually rebuilt, sorta. When Babylon fell to the Persians around 538 BC, Emperor Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and ordered them to rebuild their temple. And he told them how big to build it. Smaller. So they did. And when the foundation was complete and everyone could see how not big and how ungrand the new temple would be, the older folks in the crowd, the ones who remembered Solomon's temple, wept aloud. The newer, smaller temple was a visible reminder of how low the nation could go. Perhaps most disappointing of all, according to the text, God never moved in. Apparently, he was done with temples. Wasn't his idea to begin with, but God had not forgotten his promise to Abraham. Throughout this turbulent period of Israel's history, God would send prophet after prophet to remind the people that he wasn't finished with the nation, that he was still committed to his original promise to Abraham. In the 5th century BC, the prophet Malachi stepped onto the pages of history, and his prophecy served as a bookend to what we refer to as the Old Testament. Malachi let it be known that God was still committed to fulfilling his covenant with Abraham. Israel was still his vehicle through which he would ultimately bless the world. Speaking on behalf of God, Malachi wrote, "My name will be great among the nations, from where the sun rises to where it sets. In every place, incense and pure offerings will be brought to me, because my name will be great among the nations, says the Lord Almighty." And then later in chapter 3, "I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty." The end. Malachi turned off the lights, locked the door, and then disappeared into the desert. Not really, but it must have felt that way. For the next 400 years or so, there were no prophets to Israel, at least none that the people took seriously. The land of Judea remained under foreign control. Now, while it could be argued that God was silent during the years of Israel's oppression and occupation, he certainly wasn't still. In fact, just the opposite. The Apostle Paul captures this tension perfectly when he wrote, "But when the set time had fully come," in other words, once God had everything and everyone in place. Here's what he said. "When the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship." I love this. When no one expected it, when most had given up, as the Roman Republic transitions to empire, God moved. A carpenter discovers that his fiancée is pregnant, and while trying to decide what to do, an angel speaks to him in a dream and speaks these familiar words. "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. And she will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." And all of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel." This was it. The wait was over. God's promise to Abraham would be fulfilled. The nations of the earth were on the verge of being blessed. And as part of the process, God would visit the temple one last time, but not as a cloud. This time, he would show up as a Galilean day laborer turned rabbi, a rabbi who would start a fire that neither empire nor temple would extinguish. Today, think about it. Today, over 1/3 of the world acknowledges the rabbi from Nazareth as Lord. That is amazing. But in light of that, it makes me wonder why everybody in America doesn't go to church. We'll pick up the storyline there next time. In the meantime, maybe get yourself a cup of coffee and enjoy your discussion.